So, for those of you who watch the videos and stuff on the YouTube but are not active on the Discord, I have seen very little about this series on YouTube, but there's a bunch of people on Discord who are like active on the BookTube related Discords who've talked about this. So anyway, I finished Terra Ignota by Ada Palmer, and there's a lot to talk about, so I need to get to it, or this is going to be a really long video. Okay, so it's been a while since I did a proper series review. So for those of you who remember, generally, I'm going to talk about more stylistic aspects and reading experience first, and then more like what I thought was good and bad, rather subjectively, for the second. So this might be a series that is unfamiliar to many people. For those of you who don't know, it is a sci-fi quartet of 3 medium-length books, meaning like mid 100,000 words, and 1 quite long finale, meaning like 330,000 words, which is absurd considering it looks like it's the same length, but like the font is just like so much smaller, which is outrageous, by the way, and is a crime against publishing. They should have just, like, now everyone's gonna think that this book is kind of short. They should just be like that thick, whatever. It is relatively high, like, challenge and difficulty, medium darkness for the adult sci-fi fantasy genre, and is definitely not grimdark. I want to talk about like the frame narrative, source of conflict, and style first, because the frame narrative is very important for, I think, understanding whether this is a series for you, because it's going to impact a lot of the reading experience, because a lot of it is from the perspective of a dude named Mycroft, and Mycroft can be a bit much and is going to have a huge impact on what we see, the perspective we see it from, and the style. It's not all Mycroft. There are chapters from other people, but this is written as if it is an in-world history starting in March of the year 2454. It is set on Earth. It's set on a futuristic but earthbound civilization in like our 2454. It is like Mycroft in chapter 1 is going to apologize for the style, because he's going to say it's written in an 18th century style, and say how like you're going to feel bad because you're like unfamiliar with this. And like the thing to keep in mind, it is like a slightly archaic, like he likes to write slightly archaically, but like if you read fantasy books, a lot of them are written with an archaic style. Like A Song of Ice and Fire is written with an archaic style. The Wizard of Earthsea is written with an archaic style. Part of his warning is that he's writing it as if the people reading it are in his future. So Ada Palmer has created like her own world, obviously. That's how speculative fiction works. But like she did it better than like 99% of other people, and there are different like cultural norms and attitudes and styles. Like she considered like, hey, what's the dominant like style of literature in the year 2454 in this? And so a lot of the differences that Mycroft is apologizing for are not the differences between now and the 1800s. They're the differences between it's not having the differences between now and the 2454s. So for example, he apologizes for using gendered pronouns to describe people, for referring to people as he or she, because something we're going to get to in the later books, that is non-standard. Like that's taboo in this world in the year 2454. So like I think the first chapter can be a little bit scary, because you read it and you think that this is going to be like reading a book from like the 1800s, but it's not really like reading a book for the 1800s. It's like slightly archaic, but it's not an outlier in how archaic the writing is. And also, it's worth noting, Mycroft is going to add a lot of commentary, like some first-person retrospectives. This is part of what the different style is. So the style in this world in 2454 of doing like a retrospective is to just say what happened. And we're going to get other chapters from like other people. Like there's a guy named Martin who gets a couple. And he just kind of says what happens. And he doesn't add like commentary to things. But Mycroft adds a lot of commentary. to what happens. And a lot of the time, he's going to presume your reaction to his commentary and events, and those presumptions are going to be totally wrong because they are based on what he would presume someone from after 2454. And he'll be like, this might be wrong if this history's lasted long enough and you're actually reading it like 200 years later. But he isn't aware that he's a fictional character and that the people reading it are in the 21st century. So this was a university book club book, and I think a lot of people got annoyed. What was that noise? Anyway, a lot of people got annoyed when Mycroft is like, you're obviously thinking blank. But I think it tells us so much about Mycroft himself and about like the outlooks of the average person in this setting. In terms of source of conflict, this is very much like a political scheming driven. Like if you think of like a Game of Thrones, where the source of conflict is like, mysteries. Oh, there is a crime in this book that is a driving mystery. There was like a theft, people scheming, shifts in power, and generally a rise in conflict after years of peace that I'll get to again in like the what is it about. I'll also mention later that, but to touch on it now, that sometimes I felt the motives behind people in the political scheming felt a little bit opaque, mainly in only the first book. It actually, even by the end of the first book, specifically the last chapter of the first book, I kind of had like oh, that's what's going on. And it made it, and like in hindsight, it's like, okay, this is obviously where this was going. This makes sense. But at the time, it can be like, if you read a scene of like Littlefinger and Varys talking, but had no idea like the individual people they're talking. Actually, if you've read it, it's like no, I'm not going to say the specific scene. Anyway, it can be like that, but also so like on the macro perspective, it can be hard to follow what's going on. That's fine. I personally I found scene by scene, like each scene on its own was really interesting because there's so much interesting stuff in these books that I was fine with that. It did lead to me liking Seven Surrenders quite a bit more than Too Like the Lightning. Like I would have liked Too Like the Lightning even more if I didn't have the experience of while reading it going like, hey, like where is this going? But like it's going somewhere. So what is it about? As I mentioned, it's set on a futuristic but earthbound Earth, and a lot of the aspects of the culture and society is centered on the fact that there was a massive Third World War called the Church War that would have happened in the mid-22nd century. And since then, there's been like 3 centuries of peace. And not like the version of peace we have now where like there are no world wars, like actual peace. And it's kind of like a lot of the society, like if you ask them about like the potential for war, they'd be like, oh, like we don't do that anymore. We're civilized now. We're not like the barbarians of the past. And so that just can't happen anymore. Like it's not even really a concern. And actually that's a reoccurring theme of this kind of civilization, is that there are a lot of problems that they've just kind of pretended are over instead of actually fixing. So I mentioned like the gendered language thing going on. One like issue that they've just kind of pretended they've solved is sexism. And they've just like that they've defeated sexism, and look, like there's no gendered language because no one would ever treat people differently because of their gender. Like that, we are civilized now. So like referring to someone as he or she is like taboo. And they also, in fairness to them, do have a lot of good stuff going on. Like the life expectancy is 130 years. Something that won't be like specifically commented on because they won't specifically compare it like last, but I guess it is commented on, is there's also like right now we have countries where extreme poverty is rampant. Like there's developed and like way less developed areas of the world, and the relative like wealth, richness, standard of life is much more universal across geography in this world. It's not like there's entire areas of the world where just like most people are impoverished. There's a 20-hour work week. So they've got a lot going on, which ends up being important to the story because it leads to a lot of people wanting to ignore the problems because they're like, but we have like this stuff, which is so good, and we don't want to like ruin any of that. And another thing that they've kind of like just put to the side and pretended they've solved is, again, like the reoccurring theme of them just being like when civilization kind of like was almost recreated in a new form after the Third World War, they were terrified of it, and it was a religious-driven war. We don't get a lot of details of it. It's not going to be like, this is what happened in the Church War, but people refer to it as the Church War. And it's resulted in everyone has their own, like, counselor almost, and they have their own, like, private religion with them, where they can talk about, like, their spiritual and religious beliefs with this person, but they can't convene with others. And that's, like, against the law. And it's one of the laws that, like, there are these things called hives. Society is split into a few different hives that are not necessarily, like, based on location, because there's, like, flying cars and transit that can go anywhere within, like, a couple hours. So, like, I think it's mentioned in, like, one of the first couple chapters. It's kind of hard, like, you know, if I wake up in Vancouver and then I go to New York for lunch and for breakfast, and then I go work in Estonia, and then, you know, I have dinner in Vietnam, and then I'm actually going to go stay in my other place in, like, Brazil to go at night. That's like having a country associated with a geographical location is, like, not really a thing anymore. So there's, like, hives instead, and everyone, like, grows up, and then you choose your hive. Anyway, where was I going with this? I forget where that came from. But anyway, everyone has, like, oh yeah, there's all these hives. They have a couple, like, universal laws, and one of them is that you can't convene about religion, because the foundation of this society was in huge part based of fear of not repeating the Church War, which in fairness in some ways has been partially successful of not repeating more generally. But some places like this, like with the public religious conversations being illegal, they've, like, overreacted. And this also becomes problematic because another thing of what this book is about in terms of, like, the actual plot, other than, like, the rising like political tensions, is in, like, immediately on, like, page 2, you run into what seems to be a genuine miracle, but, like, no one can talk about it because a miracle implies religious stuff, and that's, like, super taboo and problematic. Okay, so that's my describing the series. I'm now going to go through what I think the pros are, the things that it does really well. The pros list is going to be overwhelmingly longer than the cons list. I wonder how long this video is so far. How are we doing? 12 minutes. I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm just going to start with, like, the density of interesting things about the setting and world, and just, like, the density of interesting sentences. It's just, like, off the charts. Ada Palmer has basically invented, like, a different way that people could organize society that seems plausible given the technological improvements. And she's also clearly considered what are extremely plausible downstream, like, effects of this new way of organizing society, and, like, a bunch of problems that would arise. And, like, they're really well thought out problems, and, like, big general ones and hyper specific ones were considered, and, like, the problems of each hive individually and the hive system generally. And so just the amount of, like, unique, fascinating, or thought-provoking aspect of this world is just, like, off the charts, where it's just, like, the amount of stuff where you read and you're like, oh, wow, that's incredibly interesting and to just, like, think about. Also, her command of style is just off the charts good. There will be, like, non-Mycroft chapters. Like, she starts off, like, Mycroft definitely has a distinct style, but then there will be other chapters, and you really see through the book that she can just write in whatever style she wants. And then there are also chapters that, like, literally in terms of, like, form, I don't know if I have a good example, are just like completely unique and unlike anything I've read, and they work narratively. They're not like, they add to the narrative. You get them and you're not just like reading it. It's like, oh, this is cool that she was able to pull off these style. Like, these end up being some of the most narratively poignant and impactful chapters of the entire series. She just does whatever she wants in terms of style and can get away with it. They're also, I would say, she writes incredible, like, larger than life characters who have completely like unique premises that feel like plausible, like multifaceted and complex interpretations of that premise, of that larger than life premise. But also, like, it's the type of character who's not like, this is not a series with a lot of everyman characters, or at least the more interesting characters are not like the everyman characters. There are maybe a couple, but it's generally going to be following people who are very distinctive and larger than life and very unique in a lot of ways. Sometimes in terms of like level of genius and flawed. But she does them in such a compelling way. Also, the series has some of the best reveals in terms of like lore reveals, character reveals, plot reveals, schemes that are going on. Like, up there with some of the best ones I've read, like, that do what the best reveals do, where you go like, oh, that makes so much sense. But like, I totally never saw it coming at all. And also it adds to the narrative. Like, you know, there's definitely some writers, or, you know, every once in a while you'll get to some reveal and it'll be like totally logically consistent, and you're kind of like, okay, but like, that's kind of less cool than I thought were going on. And I think Ada Palmer is amazing at that. Like, the reveals actually make it more interesting. And she just drops bars. Like, you can tell her prose is very good with the variance of style and being able to make it work. But also just, she's very elegant writer, like, descriptively, internal monologue, writing of emotions. And it's just like, if I was reading this on Kindle, I would be highlighting things. Like, it's just the type of one that makes you want to go, like, comment a line from the book and just hit it with, like, 6 fire reaction emojis. Or just, like, you know, messaging him and just, like, read it out loud and just be like, damn, that was bars. And it also, I've mentioned that this deals with the topic of, like, religious topics. I think this is the least preachy series that I've ever read in either direction. And I actually don't know what Ada Palmer's religious beliefs are. And I don't know after reading this series. Like, and I think it's not even like, you can be non-preachy by just playing it safe and just not having potential to be preachy, but she doesn't believe in playing it safe. This might be the least playing it safe series I've ever read, and she delves into these topics like at full speed, and I did not feel preached to, like, from either direction, religion good or religion bad. And I think one thing is, like, there are antagonists, because there's always antagonists, who, like, you can tell the narrative, based on the narrative, that, like, Ada Palmer thinks these people are in the wrong. Some of them, though, like, they make such a compelling case. And sometimes there's, like, a in-setting compelling case. But, like, you're like, no. So there's an example that gets talked about in spoiler-free Wheel of Time videos, so I'm mentioning it here. And that's Ishamael from Wheel of Time, who has a really interesting reason for joining, like, being one of the Forsaken. But, like, who reads Wheel of Time and is like, yeah, you know, he's right. You should join the Dark One. Like, it's a cool motivation, but it's not, like, legitimately, personally compelling. In this case, there's one antagonist in specific, but depending on whose side you're taking, actually multiple antagonists, really, because one of the people I think of as one of the most compelling, larger-than-life, interesting characters is kind of also an antagonist for some parts of the series, unless you don't want them to be. But, like, I actually found the cases they made, like, personally compelling. Like, oh crap, I might actually think they're right. And then like she gives answers as well, and somehow still manages to not be preachy. And she manages to then convince me back with cases that were even more personally compelling. It's genius. Okay, so there are some cons. As I mentioned, in book one especially, a lot of character motivations can feel opaque. Like, what is actually going on? Where is this going? So you kind of just have to, for book one, enjoy the scenes like on a scene by scene basis. Like if you're reading a short story, you don't go, oh, where is this going? You're just like, oh, that was a really cool scene. I don't think this is as true for books 2 through 4, where especially where it's kind of much more clear where it's going. But you have to read book 1 first, so it's kind of a big deal. Maybe not a big deal. It's worth mentioning. Also, while there are some truly incredible reveals, I will be honest, there are a couple reveals where I'm kind of like, all right, I guess that's what's going on. Like of who was doing this, and it's like, all right, I guess it was them. Who was this person? I guess it was him. All right, that makes sense, I guess. So it does have its fair share of that. But I think more of them are completely awesome, and the completely awesome ones outshine, like overshadow the ones that are just kind of there, because I just don't really think about the ones that were just kind of there. I could see it annoying someone if they tried to spend like an entire book guessing something and got super invested in that mystery, and then have it just be like, all right, but I didn't get super invested in those specific mysteries, partially because there are so many mysteries to be invested in that it's just like, ain't nobody got time for that. And also it's worth noting, another book specific complaint is book 3. I think it simply doesn't advance the plot enough. Like the thing is, the last like 10% does advance it quite a bit. But if you just compare like the starting position to like the 85% of the book in position, it has House of the Dragon season 2 syndrome, where you're kind of like, okay, this is how we started going into this season of television. And I mean, the final position's fundamentally kind of similar. And like, things happened, but we're in a fundamentally similar position. I still really enjoyed book 3 because of all the pros I mentioned still apply to it. But I think it is very clearly the setup book for Perhaps the Stars. Like when I finished it, someone on Discord was like, congratulations on reading the setup. Now feel free to enjoy payoff. And I'm bringing this up as a complaint, and this does not apply if you did audio. Actually, one thing that's worth as a con, so I'm actually doing book 1 on audio as a reread because I had it on Audible and I didn't have any credits and I needed something that I had. And the audio is good, but I think you have to read this series physically. Like there's so much stuff going on in terms of just like formatting that just will be missed if you read it on audio, I think. Immersion reading could be cool because I actually think the narrator so far is quite good. But like this feels like it'd be tough on audio. Maybe if you do all audio only, you won't be as annoyed by this because you're used to doing audio only, so you won't feel like you're missing out. But there's just some chapters where I'm thinking of where I'm just kind of like, how would that really work? Okay, another thing that I'm mentioning this. I don't care. It's a con. The font size of the Tor trade paperback of Perhaps the Stars is a travesty. Okay? This book is 590 pages. It's 330,000 words. Okay? I think that's longer than like a Game of Thrones. Two Like the Lightning is 165,000 words. It's 448 pages. Also, they made the pages thin. Like, look, when you own them, Two Like the Lightning looks longer. It's literally less than half the length. This book is more than double the length of this book. It's outrageous. I read what should be a 1,000-page book, and I should get to feel the accomplishment of reading a 1,000-page book. I'm angry about this. I have to know Perhaps the Stars is fucking genius. Okay. But it should be like 980 pages of genius. It should look like, I don't know, Where's a random thick trade paperback? I've got to have some of these. I don't know. It should look like this. This is This is a trade paperback that it was tore. These are similar in length. This is what this should look like. It should look like Memory of Light. I think they're the same height. Okay. Anyway. I don't know, maybe this isn't a problem for the hardcover, but I'm annoyed by this, and I stand by it. Okay. And there's one thing I want to address at the end, which is how confusing is this series? This is a series that, like, if you ask about it, it will get mentioned that, like, it's very confusing. Some people, I can only give my experience for this. I found it to be not an outlier in terms of being confusing. Like, I think Book of the New Sun was way more challenging. Book of the New Sun is awesome. There are also chapters of Book of the New Sun where I read it. And if you came up and asked me, what happened, like physically, what happened in that chapter? I would have been like, I have no goddamn idea. Like, I literally do not know what happened in this chapter. Spear Cuts Through Water, I think, was more confusing. 50 pages into Spear Cuts Through Water, if you were like, hey, what's happened in this book? I'd be like, I mean, I have some vague ideas. That never happened in this. Every time, like, if I read a chapter, if you were like, summarize that chapter you just read, I could give you a summary of what happened in that chapter. Now, if you were like, so why did this person do that? Why did this person do that? Do you remember everyone's names? No. There are a lot of characters. There are a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of world building. You know what has generally a lot of characters, moving part, and world building? Like most space operas and epic fantasy series. Like, is it probably more challenging than A Song of Ice and Fire? Yeah. But like, if you comfortably read things like Song of Ice and Fire, Wheel of Time, even Stormlight, which I know people are going to be like, Sanderson, he's the easiest person to read ever. You're in your high fantasy bubble. That series still has like 500 characters and throws you into a completely different world. Like, if you regularly read epic fantasy, I personally think you will be fine. Now, there will be people who disagree with me, who found it more confusing, and it's possible that could be you. But I just personally didn't think it was that confusing of a novel. Okay, or series. Okay. That's my review. Let's see how long this video was. Sub 30 minutes. Let's go. I'm improving. This would have been like... I thought this was going to be an hour. I feel like I talked about quite a lot. I guess having notes helped. So I hope I could put this series on your radar. I don't necessarily think now that I'm like, I hope all of you read it. Like, if I just talked about it for 30 minutes and you're like, Jake, that sounds like crap. Cool. Go for it. Oh, I should mention for a potential con, this didn't annoy me. Sometimes Mycroft will just like think about things and write the things he's thinking about for like an entire page. Whatever. There's a lot of weird things stylistically. You'll be fine. I just hope I put this series on your radar, and if you're someone watching this, you can have gone from, hey, I didn't really know much about this, to knowing where it should be on your radar. This is one of my favorite sci-fi series. Its favorite sci-fi series is, like, I have a big three, which is Sun Eater, Vorkosigan, and Terra Ignota. They're pretty far ahead of everything else. It's one of the most impressive things that I've ever read, and it's got 2 books that made it in the 9.5 range. So, which are, for those of you who know my ratings, like, I didn't read a single book all year in 2023. Like, my book of the year was a 9.4. 9.5 or higher means among my favorite books of all time, and this is among my favorite series of all time, and might be my favorite sci-fi series. So, I hope it's on your radar, and that I have been helpful. Have a good day, everyone.